Hi, welcome back. And we're still in the amazing adventures of Jeremiah. That's what I'm calling them. First things first is that being a prophet, like I've said before, but every time it just hits me, in this time was no easy feat. So we see Jeremiah imprisoned by King Zedekiah for prophesying against him. But while in prison, God gave him a heads up that his cousin would come to him and try to sell him a piece of land, which he should buy. And that happened soon after. So imagine being in prison or being incarcerated and still being able to afford to buy land. This just shows that yes, even though he was in dire circumstances, he was still being taken care of by God. We see that he was the land that he would buy would have significance in 7 years. It wasn't just an investment as far as I saw. It was an act of faith, obeying God and buying, because I'm sure at the time he didn't think he needed any land, but he did it out of obedience. But even though he bought it, he still had doubts. And he asked God for understanding through a prayer filled with praise. So we saw Jeremiah taking his concerns to God, and God responded with a reminder of all that he had said, reminding him that he is God and nothing is too hard for him to do. The concept of remembrance and repetition of truth is important for us as Christians. And this was what came through to me from this chapter, like just reminding ourselves of God's word and repeating them over and over, especially in times of doubt. I feel like it's amazing, because while in prison, right, Jeremiah again and again had to be reminded of who God was. God invited Jeremiah to call on him, right? Inviting him to pray and promised an answer to his prayer beyond his understanding. He reminded Jeremiah again of the time of restoration, and that will bring much joy. I imagine that this would have been comforting for him at the time, because being incarcerated and thinking forward to a time of joy always, lifts his spirit, because God was telling him how one day Jerusalem would have a righteous priest and a king. And of course, this was a prophecy of Jesus. The covenant God made with David was a renewal of the covenant given to Abraham, and Jesus was the fulfillment of that covenant. Chapter 34 told us the reason why Jeremiah landed in prison: for pronouncing judgment and death on the king. This is the king. I actually wrote Zephaniah, but the king's name was Zedekiah. See these Old Testament names, eh? So Zedekiah's attempt to release all the slaves. Remember, if you read, of course you read it. So remember when he tried to release the slaves at first I was like, what is he trying to do? But then trying to release the slaves, to me, was a bit suspect. Perhaps so that there will be more free people to fight, because he knew that there was a siege and a battle was coming, against the Babylonians. Nevertheless, the move by the owners of the slaves to re-enslave them was worse than not releasing them at all. Remember God's law concerning slaves in Leviticus 25:54. When slaves are supposed to be released after a certain period, I think the Jubilee year, after 7 years. And so this earned them a harsher judgment. This is the slave owners of the king for violating his covenant with them. So here's my hashtag getting to know God lesson from these verses. God is a friend of prisoners and slaves. In spite of their situation and their circumstances, or whatever the circumstances of their enslavement were, whether innocent or guilty, God is a friend of prisoners and slaves. Jeremiah was in prison, even though he didn't commit any sins, and God was with him there. God had instituted strict laws to protect the rights of slaves in that time. And if you go back to Leviticus, you'll see what the laws were concerning slaves, right? And the institution of slavery in Israel was racially based. It was set up to prevent those who had no other help in difficult situations to avoid destitution. And the Israelites were mandated to free their slaves in the year of Jubilee, which was the 7th year. God is mindful of those who've had their freedom taken away from them. Whatever the reasons may be, innocent or guilty, they are not forgotten. God has a heart towards those who are incarcerated or in slavery. Now, I believe this for people who are physically incarcerated or in slavery, or even spiritually or emotionally. God has a heart for you. God is a friend of you. And at the end of the day, he will come through for you. Thank you for joining me today. We're still in the book of Jeremiah, the amazing adventures of Jeremiah, as I call them. And I'm excited to come back tomorrow, God willing, to share lessons from Jeremiah 35 to 37. See you here. Bye.